The gorilla was already waiting at the fence when the first keeper arrived, but Milo was not watching the gate, the food cart, or the other gorillas stirring beneath the cottonwood trees. He stood with one hand pressed against a weathered wooden post at the far edge of the habitat, facing a patch of empty ground no larger than a parking space. Claire Morgan slowed her utility cart on the service road and checked the dashboard clock. 6:17 a.m. Milo had been found in that exact position 17 days in a row. What bothered her was that nothing was supposed to be there. By 6:30, the sanctuary outside Portland, Oregon, had begun its ordinary weekday rhythm. Radios crackled, hoses dragged across concrete, and a delivery truck backed toward the feed building. Milo ignored all of it. When Claire placed his breakfast about 40 feet away, he glanced toward the bucket of greens, then deliberately turned back to the empty patch. That made her stop. Gorillas could develop preferences for resting places, shade, familiar scents, or good viewing points, but this corner offered none of those things. Then Milo lowered 2 fingers into the grass and traced a short line through the dew. Claire reached for her radio but didn't call anyone yet. She had seen him touch the ground before. She had never seen him search it. 10 minutes later, Milo finally moved, walking slowly along the fence before joining the others near the feeding area. Claire waited until he was well away, then approached the spot from the staff side. There were no tracks except Milo's, no dropped food, no nesting material, and no obvious scent source. She marked the location on her tablet and compared it with the previous day's observation. The coordinates matched within a few feet. Then she noticed something that changed her first assumption. Milo had not been returning to the wooden post at all. He had been positioning himself beside a flat gray stone half hidden beneath the grass. Daniel Brooks, the senior keeper, came over after Claire showed him the records. He studied the stone through the barrier and suggested the simplest explanation: insects, roots, or perhaps some smell trapped in the damp soil. Claire wanted that explanation to work. It almost did. Then Milo returned before breakfast was finished. This time he approached quickly, stopped several feet from the stone, and became completely still. His attention shifted toward a maintenance worker walking beyond the trees. Milo waited until the man disappeared behind a storage shed before moving closer. Claire felt an unexpected chill. It looked less like curiosity now and more like caution. Daniel asked staff to keep the area quiet while they observed from a distance. Milo crouched beside the stone and brushed aside several wet leaves with the back of his fingers. He paused, listened, then brushed again. Beneath the leaves was dark soil that looked recently disturbed, although no keeper had worked there. Claire checked the habitat maintenance log. No digging. No repairs. No new planting. Yet Milo seemed to know exactly where to clear the ground. By late morning, he had left again, and Daniel inspected the location from the service side without entering Milo's space. The stone itself was ordinary, but a narrow strip of rust-colored material was visible beneath its edge. At first Daniel thought it was a root stained by the soil. He used the zoom on his phone camera instead of reaching through the barrier. The image showed a straight edge. Metal. Old metal. Claire pulled up the sanctuary's current site map. According to it, there had never been a structure in that corner. No feeder. No gate. No drainage cover. Nothing that explained why a piece of metal was buried there, or why Milo had spent 17 days finding it. Then Milo gave a low vocalization from across the habitat. Both keepers looked up. He was standing nearly 60 feet away, watching them. Daniel stepped back from the fence. Milo walked directly toward the stone, stopped over the exposed metal, and covered it carefully with leaves. Daniel did not move toward the stone again. He and Claire returned to the service path, and within minutes Milo seemed to lose interest in them. He settled near a fallen log with a handful of romaine lettuce, eating slowly while the younger gorillas moved around him. Claire noticed that he always saved the thickest piece of lettuce until last. He held it between his fingers, inspected it, then chewed while watching the trees beyond the habitat. It was such an ordinary habit that the morning almost felt ordinary again. Then Milo stopped chewing. His eyes had settled on the far corner. The leaves covering the metal had not moved, but he watched them for nearly a minute before finishing his food. Around noon, the temperature climbed into the low 70s, and most of the group moved toward the shade. Milo carried a short section of burlap from an enrichment pile and spread it beside the wall before sitting on it. Claire had seen him do that dozens of times. What she had not seen was what came next. A gust of wind lifted one corner of the burlap, and Milo caught it quickly. Instead of pulling it back beneath himself, he folded the loose edge inward with both hands, then rested one palm on it. His gaze drifted toward the gray stone again. Claire wrote down the time without knowing why it seemed important. Later, a keeper rolled several cardboard tubes filled with hay and vegetables into the enrichment area. The younger gorillas reached them first. Milo waited, chose the smallest tube, and carried it away without opening it. He sat with it tucked beside his leg for almost 20 minutes. When another gorilla approached, Milo simply shifted the tube closer to himself. There was no display and no confrontation. Eventually he opened it, removed a piece of carrot, and left the rest behind. Claire watched him walk away and realized he was heading toward the same corner again, but this time he stopped halfway there. A grounds crew had started a lawn mower beyond the outer fence. Milo remained motionless until the engine faded into the distance. Only then did he continue. He did not uncover the metal. He sat beside the stone with the cardboard tube resting near his foot. For several minutes he did nothing except listen to the sanctuary around him, distant visitor voices, birds in the cottonwoods, a cart rolling over gravel. Then a metal latch clicked somewhere behind the keeper building. Milo lifted his head so quickly that Claire looked in the same direction. No one appeared. Milo waited. His expression gave nothing away, but he remained focused on the empty service lane long after the sound had stopped. When no one came, he lowered his head and touched the cardboard tube once before leaving it beside the stone. By mid-afternoon, clouds had moved over the sanctuary. Daniel suggested retrieving the tube later if Milo abandoned it, but Claire asked him to leave it until closing. Something about its placement felt deliberate, even if they could not say what it meant. Milo spent the next hour with the group, grooming briefly, resting, and occasionally glancing toward the corner. He never returned for the tube. Just before the keepers began their evening checks, a light drizzle started. Claire passed the area in the utility cart and saw the cardboard darkening in the rain. Milo was under shelter nearly 80 feet away. He could have stayed dry. Instead, he rose and crossed the grass. Claire stopped the cart. Milo picked up the soaked tube, carried it beneath the tree, and placed it closer to the gray stone. Then he brushed rainwater from the top of the stone with the side of his hand. Claire felt the sadness of the gesture before she understood why. Milo sat there until the drizzle ended, his back toward the keepers and one hand resting near the covered strip of metal. At closing time, Daniel reviewed the day's camera footage while Claire finished her notes. Most of it showed exactly what they had witnessed. Then he found something neither of them had seen. At 5:42 that morning, 35 minutes before Claire arrived, Milo had already been at the stone. The infrared camera showed him sitting alone in the dim light. For several minutes nothing happened. Then Milo turned toward the empty service lane and extended one hand through the grass, palm upward, holding it there as though responding to something that was no longer visible. Daniel replayed the clip. Claire leaned closer to the monitor. On the third viewing, she noticed a second detail. Milo was not looking at the stone. He was looking at a precise spot on the other side of the fence. Claire paused the footage at the exact spot Milo had been watching and walked out with Daniel before the sanctuary opened. On the service side of the fence stood nothing unusual, only packed gravel, a narrow strip of grass, and an old cottonwood casting long shadows across the lane. Daniel measured the distance from Milo's stone to the place on the other side. Just under 9 feet. Claire marked it with a small orange survey flag so they could compare his behavior later. When Milo arrived, however, he did not go to the stone. He walked directly across from the orange flag, stopped, and pulled several long blades of grass from the ground. Then he laid them in a loose pile between himself and the fence. That changed everything. Claire wondered whether the location itself mattered more than the buried metal. Daniel removed the flag once Milo moved away, concerned that the new object might be influencing him. 20 minutes later, Milo returned carrying a thin willow branch. Instead of taking it to his usual resting area, he placed it where the grass had been and pushed one end carefully through the lower opening of the barrier. He released it and waited. Nothing happened. Milo pulled the branch back, rotated it, and pushed it through again. Claire felt the first real unease of the day. This did not resemble random exploration. It looked like Milo expected something on the other side to respond. The keepers checked the exterior fence line for animal tracks, dropped food, or anything that might attract him. They found only their own boot prints in the damp gravel. By late morning, Milo introduced another variation. When a keeper cart approached along the service lane, he left the group and moved toward the fence, but instead of approaching the vehicle, he positioned himself several yards from the stone. The cart passed. Milo watched its wheels disappear around the bend, then returned to the group without visiting the corner at all. An hour later, a different cart came from the opposite direction. Milo repeated the behavior. Claire wrote both times into her log. He was not waiting for a vehicle. He seemed to be checking who was driving it. Daniel contacted the veterinary team and asked them to review Milo's recent health observations. His appetite was normal. His sleep pattern had not noticeably changed. He interacted with the group and participated in enrichment. Nothing suggested an immediate medical problem, but they agreed to continue monitoring him. That afternoon, Claire tried something simple. With Milo elsewhere, she placed 3 familiar enrichment objects at separate points along the service side, well outside his reach. If he was responding to novelty, one of them might draw his attention. Milo noticed all 3. He ignored them. Instead, he approached the unmarked place where the orange flag had been and made a soft series of short vocalizations. Then he waited several seconds between each sound. Claire had heard Milo vocalize around the group before, but the spacing caught her attention. Sound. Silence. Sound. Silence. Each pause seemed directed toward the empty lane. Near closing, Daniel decided they needed a clearer record. He mounted a temporary camera facing both the stone and the service path, careful not to alter anything inside the habitat. Milo watched the installation from a distance but showed little interest. As daylight faded, he returned to the cottonwood. This time he did not uncover the metal or touch the stone. He gathered the abandoned willow branch, carried it to the fence, and placed it through the same lower opening. Then he sat several feet back. Daniel and Claire watched from the keeper building monitor. 5 minutes passed. Milo remained there. Then 10. At 12 minutes, he picked up the branch again and tapped it once against the metal fence post. The quiet sound carried across the empty habitat. He waited. Then he tapped twice. Claire leaned toward the screen. Milo waited again, listening. Nothing answered. He tapped once more, then twice, using the same rhythm. Daniel stopped writing. Claire looked at him, but neither spoke. Milo repeated the sequence a third time. 1 tap. 2 taps. Then, instead of waiting beside the fence, he walked to the precise spot opposite the empty service lane, lowered the branch to the ground, and extended his open hand through the barrier. He held it there for nearly a minute. Just before he withdrew it, Milo curled his fingers slowly around empty air, as though completing a familiar exchange with someone who was supposed to be standing there. Daniel watched the final frame for a long time before closing the video. By the next afternoon, the veterinary team had reached a cautious conclusion: Milo's repeated visits might be becoming too fixed. Nothing suggested illness, but allowing one location to dominate his attention could interfere with normal social behavior if the pattern intensified. Their recommendation was practical and temporary. For 7 days, Milo would use the adjoining habitat while staff examined the corner, checked the buried metal, and made sure there was no environmental trigger they had overlooked. Claire understood every reason behind the plan. Still, when she looked across the grass and saw Milo sitting quietly near the cottonwood, the decision felt strangely premature. The adjoining habitat was only about 200 feet away. Milo knew it well, and the rest of the group could rotate through with him. There was no isolation involved. Yet the following morning, when the connecting gate opened, Milo did something Claire had never recorded before. He walked halfway toward it, stopped, then turned back. He crossed the habitat to the old corner and touched the ground once beside the stone. Only after that did he return and pass through the gate. Claire entered the observation into her tablet. Daniel read it twice. Neither of them called it resistance. It looked more like Milo had needed to check something before leaving. Staff began their inspection while he remained in the adjoining space. They removed loose leaves, photographed the exposed metal, and used a handheld scanner to determine how far it extended beneath the soil. The first surprise came within minutes. The strip was not a small discarded fragment. It continued several feet underground in a perfectly straight line toward the fence. Daniel immediately stopped the work. Whatever they had found was probably part of an older structure, and digging without records could damage something important. For Claire, that was enough reason to delay the habitat rotation. For management, it was exactly the opposite. Until they knew what was buried there, keeping Milo away was the responsible choice. From the adjoining habitat, Milo could not reach the stone, but he could see part of the cottonwood through 2 layers of fencing. During feeding, he behaved normally. He ate, moved with the group, and investigated a new puzzle feeder. Then a maintenance cart passed the distant service lane. Milo left the feeder and climbed onto a low platform that gave him a clearer view toward the old corner. He stayed there until the cart disappeared. Claire felt her hope return for a moment. His attention was not fixed on the metal. Something about that lane still mattered. That afternoon, Daniel searched the digital maintenance archive for older site plans. The current records went back 11 years, and every one showed the corner as open habitat. He requested paper files from storage, but the archive room would not be accessible until the following day. Meanwhile, the veterinary team recommended extending the rotation to reduce disruption while the investigation continued. Claire asked whether they could leave Milo occasional visual access to the area. The answer was yes, provided his behavior remained calm. At sunset, she found him sitting on the platform again. He was not facing the tree this time. He was oriented toward the narrow section of service road visible beyond it. A keeper walked past carrying a bucket. Milo shifted forward. The keeper continued without stopping, and Milo settled back. 10 minutes later, Daniel crossed the same lane wearing his dark green jacket. Milo rose again, then sat when Daniel turned toward the office. Claire finally understood what had been bothering her. Milo seemed less interested in reaching the old corner than in seeing who might appear beside it. She told Daniel, and he looked toward the platform without answering. It was a small observation, not enough to overturn a veterinary plan. The next morning, management approved repairs to the old corner. The buried structure would be documented and removed, the uneven ground would be leveled, and the area would be reseeded before Milo returned. The work crew was scheduled for Friday. Once completed, the stone, the exposed metal, and the exact patch Milo had visited every day would no longer exist in the form he knew. Claire read the work order on her tablet while Milo sat beyond the second fence, quietly watching the empty service lane. At the bottom of the document was one final instruction: Milo would remain in the adjoining habitat until the restoration was complete. Claire reached the archive room before the morning staff meeting, carrying the work order and a cup of coffee she forgot to drink. The oldest plans were stored in flat drawers beneath rolled construction maps, most dated long before the sanctuary switched to digital records. Daniel joined her and found a site survey from 14 years earlier. The cottonwood was marked, but the area around it was different. A narrow rectangular boundary crossed the exact location of the buried metal. There was no explanation beside it, only a faded code, R2. Daniel searched the map legend. The code was missing. Whatever had stood there had disappeared from the newer plans without leaving a description behind. They took the survey to maintenance supervisor Greg Walsh, who had worked at the sanctuary for almost 20 years. Greg recognized the line but not the code. He remembered an older barrier in that section, removed during a major habitat expansion, although he could not recall what it had been used for. He did remember one detail. The service lane had once run several feet closer to the fence. That meant the place Milo kept watching had not always been empty. Claire asked what had stood there. Greg shook his head, then walked them to a storage cabinet containing photographs taken before renovation projects. Most showed drainage work, fencing, and equipment. None answered the question. Back at the habitat, Milo added another complication. Staff had placed fresh browse in several locations around the adjoining space. He selected a leafy maple branch, stripped part of it, then carried the remaining section onto the viewing platform. Instead of eating it, he broke off a piece roughly 8 inches long and pushed it through the outer mesh as far as he could. The branch fell between the two fences, nowhere near the old corner. Milo watched it briefly, then walked away. Claire no longer believed the buried metal itself was what he wanted. Daniel spent lunch reviewing old inventory records. The code R2 finally appeared in a maintenance spreadsheet from 13 years earlier beside 3 ordinary words: temporary transfer barrier. That seemed promising until they found another entry showing it had been removed after less than 2 years. There was no mention of Milo, no medical note, and nothing indicating why the barrier had existed. More puzzling was its design. According to the dimensions, it included a narrow keeper access lane on the outside. The lane ended almost exactly where Milo had been extending his hand through the current fence. Claire printed the page and placed it beside the old map. The pattern was becoming clearer, but the reason was not. That afternoon, the crew postponed excavation until Daniel could identify the structure. He inspected the exposed metal again and noticed 2 worn circular marks several inches apart. Greg believed they might have come from a latch or removable panel. Claire compared their spacing with Milo's tapping sequence from the camera footage, but there was no useful match. For a while, their strongest theory weakened again. Perhaps Milo remembered a gate opening there, or a feeding routine, or simply an old pathway associated with enrichment. Any of those explanations could fit what they had seen. None explained why he appeared to wait for a person. Near the end of the day, Claire returned to the photograph cabinet and began checking the backs of the prints instead of the images themselves. Dates, repair numbers, and staff initials had been written in pencil. One envelope was labeled with the same R2 code. Inside were 6 photographs of the temporary barrier during construction. 5 showed empty fencing. The 6th showed the cottonwood, much smaller than, with a keeper access lane running beside it. A young gorilla was visible near the fence, but the photograph was too distant for Claire to identify him confidently. She turned it over. There was only a date and a short maintenance note. Daniel compared the date with Milo's records and confirmed he had been living at the sanctuary then. But that still proved very little. Claire was about to return the photograph when she noticed something near the bottom edge. Part of the image had been cropped by the old processing machine, leaving only the lower half of a person standing in the service lane. Dark work pants. Muddy boots. One hand hanging beside the fence. In that hand was a short willow branch. Claire enlarged the photograph until the grain began to blur, but the willow branch remained unmistakable. Daniel did not try to guess. He pulled Milo's archived husbandry records from the same year and searched by date, then by enclosure code. The answer was not in the medical pages. It appeared in a keeper log filed under behavioral adjustment. For several months, Milo had been moved through the temporary R2 area during a difficult transition into a larger social group. The notes described a keeper named Thomas Reed working with him from the service lane. Thomas did not enter Milo's space. He sat outside the barrier during quiet periods, offering browse through the lower opening and waiting for Milo to approach on his own. Claire read the entry twice. Willow branches were listed repeatedly. Daniel turned to the next page, and the tapping finally made sense. Thomas had used a simple sound cue against the metal post before offering browse, allowing Milo to know he was there without approaching unexpectedly. 1 tap, followed by 2. The same rhythm Milo had repeated with the branch. What the keepers had interpreted as a strange fixation was not random behavior at all. Milo had been recreating pieces of an old routine. The stone marked where the barrier had stood. The buried strip was part of its lower frame. The empty service lane was where Thomas had waited. Even Milo's habit of watching passing carts had an explanation in the logs. Thomas usually arrived from the keeper building by utility cart before spending time beside R2. Claire thought about Milo rising whenever someone crossed that lane, only to settle again when the person continued past. He had not been guarding the corner. He had been checking arrivals. Daniel kept reading. The records never described dramatic training or unusual dependence. They showed something quieter. Milo had been reluctant to approach the new social area, so Thomas had made the transition predictable. He brought browse, sat nearby, and allowed Milo to choose the distance. Some sessions lasted only a few minutes. Others lasted nearly an hour. Eventually Milo began moving comfortably between spaces, and the temporary barrier was no longer needed. R2 was dismantled during the habitat expansion. Thomas left the sanctuary several years later. The files contained no suggestion that anyone expected Milo to retain a connection to that exact place. Then Claire found one final notation. During those sessions, Milo sometimes pushed and used pieces of browse back through the opening after taking what he wanted. Thomas had written that he would accept the branch, wait, then return another piece. Claire remembered the cardboard tube left beside the stone, the willow branch pushed through the fence, the open palm held toward an empty lane. Each action had looked incomplete because half of the routine was missing. Milo was not asking the keepers to uncover something beneath the ground. He was repeating an exchange that had once happened across a barrier that no longer existed. Daniel immediately called maintenance and cancelled the removal order. The buried frame would remain untouched until the sanctuary could document it properly. Milo could return once the veterinary team approved the rotation. That afternoon, Claire carried the old photograph to the observation room overlooking the adjoining habitat. Milo was resting on the platform, facing the cottonwood through the distant fences. She could not know what memory existed in his mind, and she refused to pretend she could. But the evidence had changed what they understood about his behavior. The place was not pulling him away from normal life. It was connected to something familiar that his environment had preserved long after the people around him had forgotten it. Daniel searched the former staff directory and found Thomas Reed's employment photograph. Older face, same work jacket, same heavy boots visible in the cropped picture. Before contacting him, Daniel checked the archived logs one last time. Near the bottom of Thomas's final R2 entry was a sentence written for whoever took over Milo's care. It said that Milo had crossed into the larger habitat without hesitation that day, but before leaving, he had returned to the fence and offered Thomas one last willow branch. Claire looked through the window at Milo. At almost the same moment, he reached down beside the platform, picked up a thin branch, and held it quietly in his hand. Daniel called Thomas Reed before the end of the day. The conversation lasted less than 4 minutes. At first, Thomas spoke carefully, asking whether Milo was healthy and whether something had happened at the sanctuary. Daniel explained the behavior, the old barrier, and the willow branches. There was a long silence on the line. Then Thomas asked one question. Does he still hold them by the thin end? Daniel looked across the room at Claire. Neither had mentioned that detail. Milo was still on the platform outside, turning the branch slowly between his fingers, gripping the narrow end exactly as Thomas had described. 3 days later, Thomas arrived shortly after noon. He was 71 now, with silver hair and a slight stiffness in his walk. He brought nothing except an old canvas work bag that the sanctuary staff inspected before he entered the observation area. Inside was a faded green cap, a pair of work gloves, and a photograph Claire had never seen. It showed Milo years earlier near the temporary barrier, sitting several feet from Thomas with a willow branch between them. Thomas ran his thumb once across the edge of the photograph, then put it back into the bag. I thought he forgot this place before I did, he said. Milo was returned to the main habitat that afternoon after the veterinary team completed its review. No special setup was created. Daniel wanted the environment to remain familiar, and Thomas stayed behind the service barrier where former staff visitors were permitted to observe. Milo emerged with the group, collected a piece of browse, and moved toward the shade. He did not notice Thomas. Claire could see Thomas gripping the strap of his canvas bag with both hands. He did not call out. Nearly 10 minutes passed before Milo began walking toward the cottonwood. Thomas lowered his eyes for a moment, as though preparing himself for the possibility that nothing would happen. Milo reached the old corner and brushed aside 2 leaves near the stone. Then he looked toward the service lane. His body became still. Thomas took 1 step closer to the designated line and stopped. Milo did not rush toward him. He simply remained where he was, studying the figure across the barrier. Claire noticed Thomas's hand trembling slightly beside his leg. He tucked it into his jacket pocket. "Hey, big guy," he said quietly. Milo tilted his head. Thomas did not repeat himself. Instead, he reached into the approved browse container Daniel had prepared and removed a willow branch. He held it by the thicker end, leaving the narrow end pointed toward the fence. Milo looked at the branch, then at Thomas. For several seconds, nothing changed. Then Milo crossed the grass and stopped at the place where the old access opening had once been. The modern barrier separated them, so Thomas could not offer the branch directly. He laid it on the staff side and rested his empty hand on his knee. Milo lowered himself on the opposite side. The two remained there without touching. Daniel quietly set his clipboard on a bench. Claire stopped taking notes. Thomas looked at the buried frame beneath the grass and gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "We took your doorway away," he murmured. Milo reached down and picked up a thin branch from inside the habitat. He turned it in his fingers, narrow end forward. Then he tapped the fence post once. He paused. 2 more taps followed. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he reached into his canvas bag and removed the faded green cap. He placed it on his knee. Milo's attention shifted immediately to it. Thomas had worn that cap in the old photograph. Milo moved closer to the barrier and sat down. There was no dramatic display, only a soft breath and the quiet movement of leaves above them. Thomas placed his palm against his own side of the fence. Milo looked at it, then lowered his branch beside the stone. Slowly, he rested his hand against the barrier opposite Thomas's. Metal remained between them. Thomas did not move his fingers. Neither did Milo. Claire looked down at the work order. Still folded inside her notebook, the one that would have erased this corner days earlier. She folded it once more and slipped it away. Across the fence, Thomas whispered, "I am sorry it took me so long." Milo stayed where he was, his hand resting quietly against the same place. For several minutes, Thomas and Milo remained on opposite sides of the barrier, neither trying to turn the moment into anything more than it was. Eventually Milo withdrew his hand first. He picked up the branch beside the stone, carried it toward the shade, and sat near 2 other gorillas. Thomas watched him go, then slowly lowered his own hand. Claire expected disappointment, but Thomas smiled. "That is good," he said. Milo had remembered, and then he had chosen to return to his group. Before leaving that afternoon, Thomas placed the old photograph back inside his canvas bag but left 1 copy with the sanctuary records. The following day brought another small change. Milo visited the cottonwood after breakfast, yet he stayed only 11 minutes. He touched the grass near the buried frame, checked the service lane once, and moved on when a younger gorilla approached carrying a cardboard enrichment box. Instead of remaining alone, Milo followed him toward the climbing structure. Claire recorded the time out of habit. 11 minutes. The visits that had once occupied long stretches of his day were becoming shorter without anyone preventing them. Daniel cancelled the plan to level the ground permanently. Maintenance stabilized the buried frame without removing it and added the location to the sanctuary archive so future staff would know why it mattered. Nothing decorative was placed there. No sign appeared inside the habitat, and no attempt was made to turn the corner into a memorial. The staff simply allowed it to remain familiar. A week later, Thomas returned for a scheduled visit. This time Milo did not go directly to the cottonwood. Thomas waited near the service lane while Milo spent almost half an hour with the group. When Milo finally noticed him, he approached at an easy pace, stopped near the barrier, and gave the post 1 tap. Thomas laughed softly. He answered by tapping the outside rail twice with his fingertips. Milo stayed for a moment, then carried his brows away. Their old rhythm had changed, but it had not disappeared. Claire began noticing changes in herself as well. She stopped treating repeated behavior as a problem to solve before understanding its context. Her observation notes became more specific. Instead of writing that Milo was fixated on the corner, she recorded how long he stayed, what happened immediately before he went there, and what he chose to do afterward. Daniel added the old R2 records to the training material for new keepers. The cropped photograph was scanned properly, and the missing history of that section was restored to the digital archive. Months of ordinary sanctuary life followed. Rain darkened the cottonwood bark. Fall leaves gathered around the stone. Milo continued eating his favorite pieces of lettuce last, exploring enrichment objects, resting with the group, and occasionally checking the old corner. Thomas visited when his schedule allowed, never arriving on a fixed day. Sometimes Milo approached him. Sometimes he did not. Thomas never called repeatedly or tried to force recognition. He simply waited on the service side, much as he had years earlier. On one visit, Milo never came to the fence at all. Thomas spent 40 minutes watching him groom another gorilla beneath the trees. When Claire apologized that there had been no interaction, Thomas shook his head. "He does not owe me one," he said. Then, as Thomas turned to leave, Milo rose from the grass. He did not walk toward the fence. Instead, he picked up a willow branch, broke off a small piece, and set it beside the gray stone before returning to the others. Thomas saw it from the service lane. He removed the faded green cap from his head and held it against his chest for a moment. By winter, Milo no longer visited the corner every day. Some mornings he passed it without stopping. On others, he touched the stone briefly before moving on. The place had not been erased, and neither had the memory connected to it. But it no longer seemed to be something Milo had to wait beside. One cold afternoon, Claire watched him. Pause there while Thomas stood quietly beyond the fence. Milo gave the post a single tap. Thomas answered with two. Milo turned away first and walked back toward his group, carrying the willow branch with him. By early spring, the cottonwood had begun showing small green leaves again, and the corner beneath it looked almost ordinary. The grass had grown over most of the exposed frame, leaving only a narrow rust-colored edge visible beside the gray stone. Claire no longer checked the camera each morning to see whether Milo had gone there. She did not need to. Some days he visited. Some days he passed within a few feet without slowing down. The old pattern that had once filled pages of observation notes had become something quieter, woven into everything else he chose to do. Thomas continued visiting every few weeks. He never brought the green cap as a signal anymore, and Daniel never arranged special sessions. Thomas simply stood along the service lane, sometimes talking softly with Claire while Milo remained elsewhere with the group. During one visit, nearly an hour passed without Milo approaching. Thomas checked his watch and smiled. "I should probably get going," he said. He had taken only a few steps toward the keeper building when Claire noticed movement beneath the trees. Milo was walking toward the cottonwood with a willow branch in his hand. Thomas stopped but did not turn around immediately. Milo reached the stone and sat down. He stripped several leaves from the branch, ate them, then held what remained by the thin end. Thomas finally looked back. Milo did not approach the barrier. Instead, he placed the branch beside the stone and rested there while afternoon light moved through the leaves above him. Thomas returned to the service lane but stayed several feet from the fence. There was no tapping this time. No open hand wading through the barrier. They simply occupied the same corner again, separated by grass, metal, and all the years between the old enclosure and the sanctuary it had become. Claire quietly walked away to finish the evening rounds. When she returned 20 minutes later, Thomas was sitting on a bench near the service road. Milo had already rejoined the group. The willow branch remained beside the stone. Thomas looked toward it and said, almost to himself, he always knew when it was time to go. It was the only thing he said about Milo that afternoon. A few weeks later, the sanctuary finished organizing the last of the old R2 records. The photograph of young Milo and Thomas was placed beside the original site map, the keeper logs, and Claire's recent observations. Daniel added no dramatic description to the file. He simply recorded that the location had historical behavioral significance and should remain undisturbed unless future animal care required otherwise. The cancelled work order stayed in the folder too, its removal instructions crossed out in black ink. Life around the habitat continued in the unremarkable way that real places do. Utility carts passed along the lane. Keepers changed shifts. Rain came and went. Visitors stopped at the viewing area without knowing why one old stone remained beneath a cottonwood tree. Milo grew less interested in checking every person who crossed the service road. He still noticed familiar keepers, but he no longer climbed onto the platform whenever a cart appeared. One evening, Claire was locking the equipment shed when she heard a single metallic tap from across the habitat. She turned toward the cottonwood. Milo stood beside the old fence post with one hand resting near it. For a moment, Claire waited for 2 more taps. They never came. Milo looked toward the empty service lane, then down at the stone. A young gorilla approached from behind him carrying a torn piece of cardboard and paused several feet away. Milo picked up the willow branch lying near his foot. Instead of pushing it through the fence, he carried it with him as he walked toward the younger gorilla. The two disappeared together beneath the trees. Claire remained beside the shed until the branches stopped moving. Then she switched off the service lane lights. Beneath the cottonwood, the gray stone sat alone in the fading evening, exactly where it had been all those years. Thank you for watching until the end of the video.